If you've ever stood in the middle of a room and felt like a stranger in your own mind, stay. Because what's happening inside your brain during menopause is not what you think it is. There is a moment that many women remember clearly, even if they struggle to put it into words. It usually happens during something completely ordinary. Maybe you are in the middle of a conversation with someone you love, and you reach for a word, a simple, everyday word, and it is just not there. You pause. You search. You smile and say something like, "Oh, you know what I mean," and the conversation moves on. But something inside you does not move on. Something inside you noticed. And somewhere, quietly, without any announcement, a small seed of worry was planted. You tell yourself it is nothing. You tell yourself you are tired, that you have too much on your plate, that anyone would feel this way after everything you have been managing. And maybe that is true, but the moments keep coming. A name you have known for years suddenly takes an extra few seconds to arrive. You walk into a room and stand there for a moment, genuinely uncertain about why you came in. You are in the middle of a thought, and it simply dissolves, like fog when you reach for it. You read the same paragraph 3 times and absorb nothing. You sit down to focus on something important, and your mind drifts before you even begin. These are not dramatic events. They do not feel like emergencies, but they accumulate. Slowly, silently, they accumulate. What is happening inside the brain during menopause is something that science is only recently beginning to fully appreciate. For decades, the conversation about menopause focused almost entirely on the body, on the physical symptoms, on hot flashes and sleep disruption and changes in weight and energy. The brain was largely left out of that conversation. But women knew. Women have always known that something shifts mentally during this transition, something that goes far beyond the physical. The problem was that there was no satisfying explanation, and without an explanation, the experience was easy to dismiss, both by doctors and by the women themselves. So women adapted. They started writing more things down. They set more reminders on their phones. They made longer lists. They apologized more in conversations, laughing it off with phrases like, "I am so forgetful lately. Blame my age." And underneath that laughter, many of them felt something far less funny. Because there is a particular kind of fear that comes when you start to doubt your own mind. It is not like fearing something outside of yourself. It is an internal uncertainty, a creeping sense that the instrument you have always relied on to navigate the world is becoming unreliable. And that fear is exhausting in its own right, layered on top of the cognitive fatigue already making everything harder. The question that deserves to be asked, and that far too few people are actually asking, is this: why is this happening? Not in vague, dismissive terms like hormones or aging, but specifically, mechanistically, what is actually going on inside the brain that causes this experience? Because when you understand the why, something important shifts. The fog stops feeling like an inevitable sentence and starts feeling like a problem with a context, and problems with contexts can be approached differently than problems that seem to arrive from nowhere. Let us start with what we know about hormones in the brain, because the connection is far more direct and far more consequential than most people realize. Estrogen, the hormone that declines significantly during menopause, is not just a reproductive hormone. That framing has done enormous disservice to our understanding of what menopause actually involves. Estrogen has receptors throughout the brain. It plays a critical role in supporting the function of neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers that allow brain cells to communicate with each other. It supports the production of acetylcholine, which is deeply involved in memory and learning. It has anti-inflammatory effects within the brain. It supports blood flow to the brain. It influences the energy metabolism of brain cells. When estrogen levels fall, the brain is not somehow insulated from that change. The brain feels it in ways that are measurable, observable, and very real. But estrogen is only part of the story. There is another hormonal shift happening simultaneously during menopause that receives far less attention, and that may actually be the central player in the cognitive difficulties so many women experience. That shift involves cortisol. Cortisol is most commonly described as the stress hormone, but that description undersells its scope considerably. Cortisol is involved in regulating blood sugar, controlling inflammation, managing the sleep-wake cycle, and influencing how the brain processes information and consolidates memories. Under normal circumstances, cortisol levels follow a predictable daily rhythm, rising in the morning to help you wake and become alert, and declining through the day and into the evening to allow rest and recovery. Research published in scientific literature has revealed something striking about what happens to cortisol during the menopause transition. As estrogen and progesterone begin to decline, typically starting in a woman's late 40s, cortisol levels tend to rise. This is not a small or subtle shift. Studies tracking menopausal women have found significant elevations in cortisol compared to premenopausal women, and that elevation has consequences that ripple through virtually every system in the body, and most especially through the brain. Here is what elevated cortisol actually does to the brain over time. The hippocampus, the region most associated with forming and retrieving memories, is particularly sensitive to cortisol. In the short term, cortisol can actually enhance memory formation, which is why stressful events are often vividly remembered. But chronic elevation of cortisol has the opposite effect. Sustained high cortisol levels have been shown in research to reduce the volume of the hippocampus over time, to disrupt the consolidation of new memories, and to impair the ability to retrieve memories that have already been stored. In plain terms, prolonged cortisol elevation makes it harder to form new memories and harder to access ones you already have. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive function, planning, focus, and decision-making, is also highly sensitive to cortisol dysregulation. When cortisol is chronically elevated, the prefrontal cortex begins to function less efficiently. Attention becomes harder to sustain. Decision-making requires more effort. The ability to filter out distractions weakens. Mental tasks that once felt automatic now require visible effort. And the subjective experience of all of this, the lived feeling from the inside, is precisely what women describe as brain fog. It is not imagination. It is not weakness. It is the measurable downstream effect of a hormonal environment that is placing the brain under a form of chronic low-grade stress. There is also the sleep dimension, which cannot be separated from cognitive function, no matter how much we might wish otherwise. Sleep is when the brain consolidates the memories formed during the day. It is when the glymphatic system, the brain's own cleaning mechanism, clears out metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking hours, including proteins associated with cognitive decline. It is when the brain essentially performs its maintenance. When sleep is disrupted, as it so frequently is during menopause due to night sweats, temperature dysregulation, and the effects of cortisol on the sleep-wake cycle, all of those maintenance functions are compromised. The brain enters the next day already behind, already working with less than it needs. And the cognitive deficits that result are not just about being tired. They are about the brain having been denied the conditions it requires to function well. Now here is the part that becomes genuinely interesting, and where the conversation about hydration and nutrition enters in a way that is far more nuanced than most people realize. When women notice their memory and focus struggling during menopause and begin looking for solutions, hydration is one of the first things that gets mentioned. And there is a reason for that. Dehydration genuinely does impair cognitive function. Even mild dehydration, a level that might not even trigger obvious thirst, has been shown in research studies to affect attention, working memory, and psychomotor speed. The brain is approximately 73% water. Its electrical activity, its chemical processes, the movement of nutrients into cells and waste products out of them, all of this depends on adequate hydration. But here is what rarely gets explained. During menopause, the body's relationship with hydration changes. Estrogen plays a role in fluid regulation. As estrogen declines, the body becomes less efficient at retaining fluid. This means that drinking the same amount of water a woman drank before menopause may not result in the same degree of hydration, because the regulatory mechanisms that help the body hold on to that water are not functioning the same way. The water goes in, but does not stay and distribute the way it once did. And there is something even more specific that matters here. something that is almost never discussed in the context of menopause and cognitive health. The brain does not run on water alone. The electrical signals that carry information between neurons, the signals that underlie every thought, every memory, every moment of focus, depend on the movement of ions across cell membranes. These ions, sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, are electrolytes. Their balance within the brain's fluid environment is precisely regulated under normal circumstances, and that regulation requires specific minerals in specific ratios. When mineral balance is disrupted, neural communication is disrupted. The brain's electrical activity becomes noisier, slower, less precise. Magnesium deserves particular attention in this context. It is one of the most abundant minerals in the human body and one of the most frequently depleted in modern diets, and its role in brain function is profound. Magnesium is involved in regulating the activity of NMDA receptors, which are critical for synaptic plasticity, the process by which connections between neurons are strengthened or weakened based on experience. This is the cellular basis of learning and memory. Magnesium also has anti-inflammatory effects within the brain and helps regulate the activity of the HPA axis, the system that controls cortisol production. Research suggests that low magnesium levels can increase cortisol output, and elevated cortisol can in turn deplete magnesium, creating a cycle that works against cognitive health. During menopause, when cortisol is already tending to run high and dietary intake of magnesium is often insufficient, this cycle can become a significant contributor to the cognitive difficulties women experience. But let us pull back and look at the ingredient that sits at the center of what women going through menopause most need to understand about supporting their brain. Because while hydration and electrolytes matter, there is something even more foundational happening at the level of cortisol regulation itself. And this is where ashwagandha enters the picture, not as a trend or a wellness buzzword, but as one of the most extensively studied botanical compounds in the world, with a specific and well-documented relationship to the hormonal disruption at the heart of menopausal brain fog. Ashwagandha, known scientifically as Withania somnifera and used for thousands of years in Ayurvedic medicine, has accumulated a body of clinical research that is remarkable both for its size and for the consistency of its findings. It is classified as an adaptogen, which is a term with a specific meaning, a compound that helps the body adapt to stress by modulating the activity of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the central regulatory system for cortisol, and the stress response. What this means in practical terms is that ashwagandha does not simply suppress cortisol or stimulate it. It helps bring cortisol toward a healthier baseline, whether it has been chronically elevated by stress, disrupted sleep, or the hormonal shifts of menopause. The research on ashwagandha's effects on cortisol is not anecdotal. Multiple randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials, which are the gold standard in clinical research, have examined its cortisol-modulating effects. In one particularly rigorous study examining a concentrated and standardized extract of ashwagandha, participants experienced significant reductions in serum cortisol levels compared to the placebo group. The effects were not marginal. They were substantial, and they were accompanied by measurable improvements in the subjective experience of stress, in sleep quality, and in cognitive function measures, including memory and concentration. These are outcomes that matter directly to the experience of menopausal brain fog. The mechanisms through which ashwagandha exerts these effects are multiple and interacting. Its active compounds, primarily a class of steroidal lactones called withanolides, have been shown to interact with receptors in the HPA axis in ways that help normalize cortisol rhythm. They have anti-inflammatory effects within the nervous system. They appear to support the health of mitochondria within neurons, which matters because neurons are extraordinarily energy-demanding cells, and mitochondrial dysfunction impairs their ability to function at full capacity. There is also evidence that ashwagandha supports the regeneration of nerve cell components and the growth of dendrites, the branching extensions of neurons that form connections with other cells. This is not a passive or indirect effect on brain health. It is a direct engagement with the structures and processes that support cognition. What makes ashwagandha particularly relevant to the menopausal context specifically, rather than just to stress in general, is the relationship between cortisol and the sex hormones. Research has shown that chronically elevated cortisol actively interferes with the production and regulation of estrogen and progesterone. The stress response system and the reproductive hormone system compete for resources and regulatory attention. And when the stress system is chronically activated, as it tends to be during menopause when cortisol rises alongside the hormonal transition, the reproductive hormone system is further destabilized. This is why women often notice that their symptoms worsen during periods of additional stress. The cortisol increase compounds the hormonal disruption already occurring. By helping to moderate cortisol, ashwagandha can therefore support a more stable hormonal environment, which in turn creates better conditions for the brain to function clearly. The cognitive improvements associated with ashwagandha are documented across multiple studies examining different populations, including middle-aged adults and older adults, the populations most relevant to the menopausal experience. Research has found improvements in immediate memory, general memory, executive function, attention, and information processing speed among participants taking ashwagandha supplementation compared to placebo. These are the precise cognitive domains that women report losing access to during menopause. The slowed processing, the difficulty with attention and focus, the reaching for memories that are not quite accessible, all of these correspond to the domains where ashwagandha shows measurable benefit. Sleep quality improvements are also consistently documented in ashwagandha research, and this matters enormously for the brain fog discussion because of the relationship between sleep and cognitive function already described. In studies examining sleep outcomes specifically, ashwagandha supplementation has been associated with improvements in sleep onset latency, meaning people fell asleep more quickly, in total sleep time, in sleep efficiency, and in subjective measures of sleep quality. For women whose cognitive difficulties during menopause are being compounded by chronic sleep disruption, addressing the sleep dimension through cortisol modulation represents a potentially significant part of the solution. Now, something important needs to be acknowledged here, because there is a pattern that plays out for many women during menopause that is both understandable and ultimately counterproductive. When the memory and focus difficulties begin, when the brain fog becomes noticeable, the instinctive response is to work harder, to push through, to compensate with effort for what feels like a deficit in mental sharpness. More lists, more reminders, more checking and rechecking, more forcing concentration through fatigue. And this approach increases stress. It activates the cortisol response. It elevates the very hormone that is contributing to the cognitive difficulties in the first place. The harder the push, in many cases, the worse the fog becomes. Understanding this cycle is important not to generate despair, but to point toward a different approach, one that works with the body's regulatory systems rather than against them. This is why women who begin to address the cortisol dimension of their menopausal experience often report that multiple things seem to improve simultaneously. Not just memory and focus, but sleep quality, mood stability, the ability to tolerate stress without being overwhelmed, the sense of feeling more like themselves. These outcomes are not independent of each other. They are downstream consequences of the same underlying hormonal regulatory environment. When that environment becomes more balanced, when cortisol finds a healthier rhythm, and the cascade of downstream effects begins to normalize, the improvement is not narrow and isolated. It is broad and interconnected, just as the original disruption was. Let us talk about what many women are currently doing in response to their cognitive symptoms during menopause, because the gap between what is commonly tried and what the research suggests actually helps is significant. Most women start with sleep hygiene improvements, which is sensible but often insufficient because the sleep disruption is hormonally driven, not just behaviorally driven. They try caffeine to push through the fatigue, not realizing that caffeine stimulates cortisol release and can actually worsen the underlying hormonal disruption over time. They try brain training apps and mental exercises, which have some value for specific cognitive skills, but do not address the physiological conditions limiting brain performance. They try multivitamins, which provide broad nutritional support but often lack the specific compounds in the therapeutic forms and dosages that research has identified as relevant to the menopausal experience specifically. What is happening is that many women are treating the symptoms without fully understanding the mechanism. They are addressing the fog without addressing the conditions producing it. And there is a reason for this gap. Until relatively recently, the conversation about menopause was almost entirely focused on estrogen replacement, estrogen support, estrogen supplementation. Cortisol's role in the menopausal experience was understood in research settings but had not fully translated into the broader conversation about how women can support themselves during this transition. Many women have reported experiencing meaningful improvement in mental clarity and memory when they began to understand how intelligent hydration, specific minerals, and the right nutritional support influence the brain during menopause. For women who want to understand how to improve memory, reduce brain fog, and recover mental clarity during menopause, there is a guide in the first link in the description that brings together the research in a form that is accessible and actionable. The emotional dimension of menopausal brain fog deserves more direct acknowledgement than it usually receives, because the cognitive symptoms do not exist in isolation from the emotional experience of having them. When you forget something you should have remembered, there is often a flash of something close to shame. When you cannot find a word mid-sentence with colleagues or friends, there is exposure, vulnerability. When you miss an appointment or forget a commitment to someone you care about, there is the particular distress of feeling like you have let someone down, combined with the unsettling awareness that you cannot fully trust your own memory to prevent it happening again. These experiences accumulate emotionally over time in ways that can affect self-confidence, professional performance, and the quality of relationships in ways that go far beyond the cognitive symptom itself. Women describe beginning to second-guess themselves in professional settings where they used to feel sure-footed. They describe feeling less present in conversations because part of their attention is always monitoring their own cognitive performance, watching for the moments when the brain fails to deliver what is needed. This hypervigilance is exhausting. And ironically, the stress it generates feeds directly back into the cortisol elevation that is contributing to the cognitive difficulties in the first place. This is why the emotional relief that women describe when they begin to regain cognitive clarity is often disproportionately large relative to the specific improvement in memory or focus. What they are experiencing is not just improvement in a function, but restoration of trust in themselves. The ability to participate in a meeting without anxiety. The ability to have a conversation and be fully present in it. The ability to commit to something without the background fear of forgetting. These are not small things. They touch the sense of identity and capability that a person carries through their daily life, and their restoration represents something close to reclaiming oneself. There is a method explained in the pinned comment for women who desire to recover focus, memory, and mental energy naturally during menopause. The brain fog of menopause is real, the suffering it causes is real, and the pathways toward recovery are also real. They require understanding the why before focusing on the what. They require recognizing that cortisol is not a peripheral player, but a central one in the menopausal experience. They require patience and consistency, because the restoration of a regulated hormonal environment and optimized brain function is a process, not an event. The memory that felt like it was slipping away is still yours. The clarity that felt like it was leaving is still there, waiting for the conditions that allow it to return. You are not losing yourself. You are navigating one of the most complex physiological transitions the human body goes through, and it is entirely possible, with the right knowledge and the right approach, to find your way back to a mind that feels like home.